What if the problem isn't your body, it's the pattern? Because once you see patterns are flexible, not fixed, everything about your knitting starts to change. For a long time, I thought I just had to make patterns work as they were, but the truth is, patterns are just the starting point. I've spent years learning how to adjust patterns to my own body, including designing my own knitted wedding dress. In this video, I'll show you exactly how to do that in a simple step-by-step way, so that you can actually knit clothes that feels like they are made for just you. I've also made a free PDF going over everything I'm going to talk about in this video, and that's available in the description. I recently found a pattern that I completely fell in love with, the Slanting Slipover by Anne Wenzel. You know that feeling, when you can already picture it in your wardrobe, how it would fit your life, how often you wear it. So I did what I always do. I made a swatch, I checked my gauge, and I bought the pattern. And then I went to choose my size. I realized that pattern only went up to 112 centimeter bust. And to be honest, I was a bit surprised. Not because this never happens. As a plus size woman, I'm very used to not finding my size in stores. I almost expect it. I go in assuming I probably won't find something that works for me. But knitting has felt kind of different. In the knitting space, I've gotten used to, maybe not always, but often being included. I usually knit sizes between 120 and 140 centimeter bust, and still I've had that feeling that there is a space for me here. So when I saw that this pattern didn't include my size, it just made me pause. Because knitting for me has been so much more than just making clothes. It's been the first time I've been able to build a wardrobe that actually reflects me. Not something I'll settle for, but something that I've actually chosen myself. I've gotten to make things that actually fits my body, my preferences, and my life. So sitting there with a pattern that didn't include me, it felt a little bit like being back in those fitting rooms when I was younger. Watching friends find things they loved while I was kind of standing on the outside, already knowing it probably wouldn't work for me. And I think that feeling is something many of us carry in different ways. So then the question becomes, what do we do with that? Because I already had the yarn, I already had the idea, I still wanted this vest. And for me, the answer was, I'm going to knit it anyways, but I'm going to modify it. Now, I do want to say, the ability to do that is a privilege. Being able to look at a pattern and adjust it to fit your body is a skill and something I've built over time. It's not something everyone feels comfortable doing, and it's also not something everyone should have to do just to be included. At the same time, modification is also where so much freedom lives. It's where knitting becomes truly yours. So I've been thinking a lot about this balance, about what I want to support, what I want to promote, and how I want to use my platform. And I think where I've landed, at least for now, is this. I want to be more intentional about choosing and supporting size-inclusive designers going forward. At the same time, I don't want to limit what I make based on whether someone else decided if it was for me or not. Patterns are suggestions, not rules. You are allowed to take something and shape it into what you need. So in this episode, I want to walk you through exactly how I approach that, how I take a pattern that's not in my size and turn it into something that is. Not in a perfect, technical, overwhelming way, but in a way that feels approachable and hopeful, a little bit empowering. Because at the end of the day, you deserve knits that fit, not just in size, but in how you want to feel when you wear them. So let's talk about how I've approached and modifying the Slanting Slipover. Not to give too much of Anne Wenzel's pattern away, I'm going to strictly talk in measurements and percent, not in stitches and increases. But we will go over a few more examples afterwards, so I hope you will be comfortable doing this yourself after watching this video. On my body, I tend to have narrower shoulders and waist and more volume around my hips and stomach. And garments like this, the fit over the shoulders really matters. If they are too wide, it kind of extends out and makes you look broader than you are. And if it's too narrow, it pulls and just won't sit right. So for me, getting the upper section to fit well is really the foundation for the whole garment going forward. That's why I decided to cast on a smaller size at the top and then gradually work my way up to the size I need as I knit down the body. For this slipover, my cast on corresponds to a size around 120 centimeters bust. And by the end, it is more of a size around 135 centimeters bust. Right from the beginning, this pattern only goes up to 112, so I needed to make an adjustment quite early on. I didn't want to change too much around the neckline because I like it slightly close fitting. So I kept the ribbing, the stitch count as written, but I did increase the number of stitches that I cast on each side. I increased by about 10 centimeters, which meant that overall the front is about 5% wider than the original size at this stage. After that, I kept knitting for a bit, just letting the fabric grow, moving on to the next set of adjustments. As I approached the point of the underarm, I also approached the point where I needed to add more stitches. Since I'm moving from what was 112 centimeter size to about 135, I needed roughly 20% more stitches in total. So I looked at how the pattern distributed increases. In this case, it was 4 places on each side of the front and each side on the back. And then I looked at the total number of stitches I needed to add, and then I divided them across those increase points. That gave me a clear, manageable way to scale up the size without changing the structure of the pattern too much. And then there was the length, because it's not only about the width. If you only add stitches and increases on top of what's already in the pattern, the armholes can end up sitting way too low, which affects the whole fit of the garment. My approach is usually a mix of a little bit of math and a little bit of intuition. So for this one, I started my increases a little bit earlier than what the pattern suggests, while still allowing the body to become a little bit longer overall. This was not perfectly calculated, and I actually think that's okay. But in a moment, I'll walk you through how you can calculate this more precisely, if that feels more comfortable for you. So before I go deeper into how to modify, I just wanted to pause for a moment and talk about something that sounds a little bit intimidating, but it really doesn't have to be: knitting math. And I know even just saying that can make it feel a bit heavy, but I promise you this is actually much simpler and much more approachable than it might sound. I really only come back to a few small formulas again and again. And once you get comfortable with them, they become this really quite supportive tool in the background of your knitting. The first one is how to convert measurements like centimeters or inches into stitches. The way I think about this: how many stitches will fit into a certain width? You can take your measurement, multiply it by your stitch gauge, and then divide it by 10 if you're working with centimeters, or by 4 if you're working with inches. For example, if you want something to be 100 centimeters wide and you have a gauge of 18 stitches by 10 centimeters, this is what you do. You take 100 times 18 and then you divide it by 10, which gives 180 stitches. And this one is really useful when you are adjusting for width, whether you're sizing up or sizing down, or just trying to figure out where you want to land. Then you have the opposite. If you already have a stitch count and you want to understand how wide that is actually going to be, then you take the number of stitches, you divide it by your gauge, and then multiply by 10 if you're working in centimeters and 4 if you're working in inches. An example is if you have 112 stitches, you have the same gauge of 18, and you divide 112 by 18, and then you multiply it by 10, which gives you 62 centimeters. I find this really helpful when I'm picking up stitches or when I'm looking at a pattern and trying to understand what does this actually mean for my body. And lastly, there's length. Because just like we adjust for width, we often want to adjust how long something is. Maybe adding a bit more length to the body or adjusting where the shaping happens. So here we'll look at the raw gauge instead. You take the length you want to add or remove or figure out. You multiply by your raw gauge and then divide by 10 if you work in centimeters, or 4 if you work in inches. And this gives you the number of rows length represents. And that's really it. It's not about being perfect or getting everything exactly right the first try. It's about having a way to understand your knitting a little bit better and to make small intentional changes that brings you closer to something that fits your life. So a little bit of math in service of a lot more freedom. Now let's talk a little bit about adjusting a top-down raglan sweater, because I think sometimes the way raglan shaping is usually explained is a bit too simplified. You often see it described as just increase every second round along those diagonal lines. And yes, that works, but it doesn't always create the best fit. And this becomes especially noticeable as sizes get larger or smaller, because our bodies move further away from that very standardized shape. The human body is made up of straight lines. It's made up of soft, connected curves. And that gentle S shape is happening from the neckline over the shoulders and then into the armhole and then down the body. The sleeve and the body doesn't exist separately, they flow into each other. So if you want a garment that actually follows those lines and doesn't bunch or pull, we need to shape our raglan a little bit differently. This is where a compound shaping comes in. Instead of increasing at one consistent rate all the down the yoke, compound shaping means we adjust how often we increase depending on where we are in the yoke. So rather than treating the whole section the same, we let the shaping reflect the body a little bit more. That often looks like a bit more aggressive shaping right at the top, near the neckline, then slowing down the increases across the chest and back, and then sometimes adjusting again as we move towards the bottom of the armhole, where the curve becomes tighter. And what this does, it allows the raglan lines to follow the body more naturally. The result is something that feels more comfortable and often looks a bit more tailored, even though it's very much a handmade piece. So if you want to start customizing like this, there are 2 measurements you always come back to. It's your bust circumference and the desired yoke depth. The part that goes from here, where your sweater sits, along the raglan seam onto your underarm. First, we need to figure out how many stitches we actually need for our body. So you take your measurements around your bust and then you multiply it by your gauge. You divide it by 10 or 4 if you're working in inches, and then you get your number of stitches you need. So let's say you want a bust circumference of 130 centimeters and your gauge is 20 stitches per 10 centimeters. You take 130 times a 20 and then divide by 10, which gives you 260 stitches for the body. Then you look at how many stitches you cast on at the neckline. Then you subtract that from your total. So if your neckline cast on is 60 stitches, that means you have to increase 200 stitches to get where you want to be. The raglan increases for the body usually happens in 4 places per round. On this side of the raglan and this side of the raglan, both in the front and the back. You divide your increase number by 4. So you divide 200 by 4, which gives you 50 increase rounds. And then we have to bring in the length of the yoke, because those 50 increase rounds needs to fit within the yoke depth you desire. So if you want the yoke depth to be about 30 centimeters and your raw gauge is 28 rows per 10 centimeters, this is what you do. You take 30 times 28, divide by 10, which gives you 84 rounds. And what that tells you is that you can't increase every other round all the way down like a standard raglan sweater. You need to vary your rhythm. So in this example, that might look like starting with 17 rounds of increases every round at the top and then going over to 33 increases worked every other round. And that shift in rhythm is what creates that softer, more natural shaping. In this example, I haven't adjusted the sweater's neckline or sleeves. That's a whole deeper layer of construction and something we could absolutely spend more time on. So I am a bit curious, would you like to dive deeper into fit and construction like this? Let me know. Next, let's talk about a set-in sleeve or a saddle shoulder sweater. And this one is a little bit more abstract because there are several ways to construct this kind of sweater, but I want to share a general approach that I found really helpful, and it's also the method I used for the slanting slipover. For this type of construction, I usually base my adjustments on 3 key measurements. Your cross shoulder measurement from the shoulder point right here to the shoulder point right here. I usually like a fit that is a bit narrower than where my shoulder is, because I have quite a soft curve for my shoulders. And you want to know your armhole depth. This is not the same as your raglan length. This is from the shoulder point you found in the previous measurement all the way down to your armhole, where you separate for body and sleeves. And here you also need your full bust measurements. And the reason we include the shoulder measurement here, unlike the raglan, is that these garments are much more tailored across the shoulders. So for the sweater to really sit nicely, your actual shoulder width and the garment's shoulder need to align quite closely. So I always start with a cross shoulder measurement. From there, we want to figure out how many stitches we need at the shoulder. If you're working a set-in sleeve in the flat, you need to use a single cross shoulder measurement, both for the front piece and the back piece. And if you're working a saddle shoulder in the round, you need to double that measurement from one shoulder to another to get all the width you need to go completely around. Here we use the same formula we talked about earlier, converting centimeters or inches into stitches to find the shoulder stitch count. From there, how you apply it depends a little bit on the construction. For a set-in sleeve, you simply cast on more or fewer stitches than the pattern suggests to match your measurements. You might want to add more or less short rows if you want more or less shaping as well. And for a saddle shoulder, we usually increase along the shoulders till you get the desired stitch count. And then we move on to how to fit the yoke down the bust. From here, the process actually becomes quite similar to what we did with the raglan. You calculate your full bust stitch count using the same formula as before. Then you subtract that shoulder stitch count from the total, and that gives you the number of stitches you need to increase through the body. And just like before, since we typically increase in 4 places for the body, you divide that number by 4 to figure out how many increase rounds you'll need for your body. One small thing to keep in mind here, if you're working a flat set-in sleeve, remember to use the total stitch count across both the front and the back when you're comparing to your bust, not just one panel. And the final piece is how we distribute the increases for our bust. Here we'll take armhole depth and convert that into rows using the same length formula we talked about earlier. And that gives you the space you have to work your shaping within. And here, if you want the garment to follow the body naturally, my gentle recommendation is to place the increases at the lower part, near the armhole. Because again, the body isn't straight, the curve becomes more pronounced as we move down. So letting your shaping reflect that usually gives a smoother, more comfortable fit. But remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, just a little bit intentional. Lastly, the circular yoke is a round construction, easily recognized by its smooth, contiguous curve around the shoulder instead of increasing along defined lines like a raglan. Here the increases are distributed evenly across the entire circumference of the garment. In other words, the shaping happens more horizontally than vertically. Circular yokes are often associated with Icelandic sweaters or Fair Isle designs, but they can also feel very modern and refined depending on how you're styled and its construction. Because the circular yokes can be constructed in many different ways with increases in different intervals, the process is a bit less standardized. However, the core principles are very similar to the raglan shaping. You still want to base your adjustments on your full bust measurement and the desired yoke depth. First, you calculate how many stitches you need at the bust, then compare this to your cast on or starting stitches count to determine how many stitches you need to increase overall. From there, consider whether you need more increase rounds, more frequent increases, or additional rounds to achieve the right yoke depth. The key is to distribute your increases evenly across rounds. You can either work larger increase rounds spaced further apart or add more frequent, smaller increase rounds. So the next time you look at a pattern and think, this isn't quite made for me, I hope you remember, you can change it. You don't have to wait for permission, you don't have to settle. And if you like, I'll take you even deeper into this. I've been thinking about creating a full Knits That Fit series, breaking down construction, shaping, and all those small decisions that make a big difference. So please let me know if that's something you'd love to see. Also, check out my latest podcast episode where I talk even more about this mindset, how we can move from following patterns to really owning what we create. You can find that linked right here. And as always, keep knitting what brings you joy.